One of the biggest buffs handed out this season was to our exotic weapon, Vex Mythoclast. I know the focus right now has been on Sunshot, Polaris Lance, and a number of other solo weapons, but let me just say, Vex Mythoclast is putting out. In this video, we're going to cover Vex Mythoclast, its catalyst, the buff, what it received, and essentially narrow down how good Vex Mythoclast is this season. We're also going to touch on PvP too. So starting off with the basics, Vex Mythoclast's whole gimmick comes from its exotic perk, Timeless Mythoclast. This reads, this weapon fires full auto when in its default firing mode. Now what this does, as many of you know, is that it gives Vex all the attributes of a 360 round per minute auto. Now keep in mind, inside of Destiny, it's coded as a fusion rifle, meaning despite this weapon shooting like an auto rifle, only fusion rifle artifact perks are applicable to Vex Mythoclast. And I only bring that up because we have Overload auto rifle this season, and I just want to point out that no, it has no effect here for Vex Mythoclast. Now for Vex's second perk, Temporal Unlimiter. This reads, defeating targets, build stacks of overcharge. Swap firing modes when fully overcharged. In alternate firing mode, hold the trigger to charge up and fire a more powerful linear fusion rifle shots. Now this perk is what allows Vex to eat up large health bars. You get stacks while in its base auto rifle fusion rifle mode, with higher tier enemies granting more stacks per kill. And then holding your reload button will grant you 3 linear fusion shots that take out whatever big and bad is in front of you. Then lastly, its exotic catalyst. This gives us the perk Calculated Balance, which reads, while in full auto mode, final blows with this weapon grant bonus damage, accuracy, and stability for a short duration. Now this catalyst assists Vex in the add clear department, but it definitely helps in that, considering Vex Mythoclast is already an exotic, it's getting that 40% buff against red bar enemies, and with the catalyst, it's giving us another 20% damage buff. Now Vex has been with us for years now. Everybody has seen it back in its prime when Particle Disruption was an artifact mod that was beautiful for fusion rifles, but especially Vex Mythoclast. Now since then, there's been a lot of other primary weapons brought to us that are really strong, most notably Quicksilver Storm. You have options like Osteostriga, Revision Zero, Wish Ender, and of course this season for Grandmaster Nightfall's Polaris Lance. Luckily for us, Bungie noticed that Vex was falling behind, which is why they buffed it. In 7.3.0, Bungie increased the damage versus minor red bar combatants by 10%, and against bosses by 25%. But against champions, they increased damage by a whopping 200% when in its linear fusion rifle mode. Now that is a big bump in damage. Now before we tackle the very obvious elephant in the room, Vex has had its damage increase across the board. And all of these buffs are a boon to Vex's performance. Vex is now a little bit better at handling all those red bars, running around, and even receiving a 25% buff against bosses. And again, keep in mind, this is all good because it's contributing to Vex Mythoclast getting stacks more often. But the overwhelming damage buff here is that whopping 200% damage in its linear fusion rifle form. Now keep in mind, it's against champions. And from Bungie's words here, they state that this places it in a unique space of being more of a Swiss Army knife and less of a specialist. Now we're going to break down the damage increase and show off some examples, but I actually think Bungie really nailed this goal. So jumping straight into the data, I decided to look at Vex inside of Nightfalls at Legend, Master, and Grandmaster difficulty. And the goal of this was to see how Vex would chunk a champion's health bar. Starting at Legend, against an unstunned barrier, Vex dealt 91,908 damage in one shot, taking away about 40% of its health. Moving up onto Master difficulty, a single linear shot does 82,211 damage and deletes about 35% of this barrier's health bar. And then at the top of the list, we have within Grandmaster Nightfalls, where Vex deals 76,376 damage, doing about 30% of their health. Now before we jump up and say, oh my god, Vex can 3-shot a champion in GMs, we need to touch on a couple of things. First being that to actually kill the champion, you're going to probably want them to be stunned, which means Vex won't necessarily be asked to completely shred them all on its own. This is especially true for unstoppable champions thanks to their damage resist. And then the other thing that we should mention is that within the Nightfall, Vex is taking advantage of this season's Solar Surge. Now granted, most seasons were just like, yo, we've got a month left or a month and a half. No, we've got 5 months. So it's not like this is a temporary thing. Get crazy with solar weapons, guys, and get comfortable because we're going to be here for quite some time. Now we also have to give comparisons in context, and this is really important when talking about other top competitors in that primary slot. We've got things like Revision Zero, which also got a massive buff, and Quicksilver Storm. Now Revision got a big buff this season. Alongside Vex Mythoclast, Bungie essentially increased damage versus champions by 100%. So inside of Grandmaster Nightfalls, Revision Zero Sniper dealt 63,353 damage, which is roughly 25% of this champion's health bar. Now Revision does get more shots than Vex. It also has intrinsic anti-barrier. I know we have artifact mods this season, which grants Vex Radiant very easily, but outside of this season, that's a big bonus here for Revision Zero. On top of that, accumulating those sniper shots don't require kills, just simply landing those precision hits. But for the sake of damage to damage comparisons, yes, Vex does outdamage it here. Then we have Quicksilver Storm, one of the best weapons Bungie has ever made. It's Strand, it synergizes with our Seasonal Surge, it has nanotech rockets, but the big thing is that it converts into a grenade launcher, which beautifully synergizes with our Strand subclasses. Now the damage from these grenades, and just to give you a perspective, is 35,290 damage, which is roughly 15% of this champion's health bar. Keep in mind though, the ease of use of Quicksilver Storm vastly outweigh Vex Mythoclast, but we cannot overlook the damage that Vex puts out. Vex is doing more than double the damage of Quicksilver Storm inside of GMs. That's essentially what 200% more damage will get you. So although you may not have the ease of use of Revision Zero or Quicksilver Storm, what you do have is a damage dealer that can melt things when you need it to melt. Also, don't worry about any testing inconsistencies. We made sure that all weapons were either surged or overcharged in order to keep the comparisons fair. But that is the balancing that Bungie has been doing. One side you have ease of use, the other side you have lethality. Now with all of that out of the way, let's talk about how to add Vex Mythoclast to your loadouts, how to really amp up this weapon, most notably from the artifact mods. Keep in mind though, activities that don't involve champions. Vex Mythoclast is still good, but that big buff to its linear form, that's applicable to champions only. So things like Nightfalls, Lost Sectors, even Master Rates, that's where Vex is going to excel. Now something I did notice in GMs this past season is Bungie has actually pulled back the number of champions and started adding just more yellow bars in general. That 200% buff does not apply to those guys. Again, it's champions only. It's actually curious why Bungie did this. Maybe it was in anticipation of Vex and Revision Zero getting these massive buffs to deal with champions. Now with Vex being a solar weapon, it falls into that group of other solar weapons that are going to absolutely pop off. Solar artifact perks this season are phenomenal. You've got Kindling Trigger, which allows Vex to scorch enemies. Flint Striker, which gives you effectively infinite free radiance, which means you don't even have to rock Rain of Fire, which is still a great exotic. But what I'm saying here is that you don't need it. Then we have Rays of Precision, which gives you ignitions. All of these things are contributing to Vex Mythoclast putting out hefty amounts of damage and essentially giving you more stacks more often. Again, it's not like Quicksilver Storm and Revision Zero where you could just pump shots into the same enemy and get stacks to contribute to that sniper shot or that grenade launcher shot. Vex Mythoclast has to get kills in order to get that linear shot. Now, the main thing I want to talk about before moving on from the artifact is how a passive effect like Kindling Trigger allows Vex to really shine. Radiant is a 25% buff. Fellas, this is applying to Vex on every level. Looking at the footage here in GM content, a Radiant Vex Mythoclast is 3-shotting this barrier. In Master Nightfalls, it kills a barrier in 2 crits in a body. And in Legend Nightfalls, it's killing this barrier in pretty much 2 shots. And keep in mind, this isn't a build or an exotic combo or anything. It's just Vex with Radiant, which is being granted from an artifact, which means you're not locked to playing Warlock and Rain of Fire. We start tagging on things like debuffs, surge mods, and anything else, and Vex only gets stronger. Now, does this completely remove the lethality of Polaris Lance and Sunshot? Absolutely not. Those are still great weapons for different reasons. Polaris is that plinker from afar if you're trying to chain ignitions back to back. Sunshot is that phenomenal ad clear weapon. Vex is like in the middle of that, requiring you to play a little more aggressively, having the ability to clear ads, but also the ability to chunk down champions, which takes us to the difference in the content that you're going to be approaching with Vex Mythoclast: group content and solo content. The reason behind this is being how you stun champions. Starting in solo content, the goal is to have Vex ready at all times. That means you're making sure you're getting your stacks of overcharge between champions and knowing what you need to do in order to stun your next champion. If it's an anti-barrier, that's perfect. You can just use Vex the entire time, thanks to Flint Striker and Radiant. If it's an unstopped champion or an overload, you do want to have a stun ready for them, as Vex can't help you there. This means an ability or one of your other weapons, but once you stun that champion, you only have a few seconds to pull Vex out. Then you have to switch fire modes and then fire. That is the other unfortunate thing about it. You can't swap fire modes, swap off, and then swap back. You have to swap over, then switch fire modes, and then shoot it. Do not toggle your shots and then swap off. You will lose those shots. Kind of one of those things I wish Bungie would have changed alongside this buff. That would greatly add to the ease of use here. The other thing is don't waste Vex's linear mode on things like orange bars. You want to save those linear shots for the heavy health targets. And the reason why I'm bringing up the difference between solo and group is because if I had to choose a solo weapon, I think I would choose something other than Vex, simply because it just doesn't have that ease of use. There are just other better options. But in group content, when you've got other people contributing to stunning those champions, this is fantastic for you to take advantage of with Vex. So guys, that is our review here of Vex Mythoclast. For PvP players, Vex received no change this past season. Now, the only change PvP players really need is for it to go back from being a 360 to a 390. I know Bungie was all concerned that Vex Mythoclast was going to be way too strong after the range changes, but it's apparent now that it needs to be a 390. That's what made Vex Mythoclast so special. So I love the buff that was handed out to it inside of PvE, but for PvP, converting it to a 390 would finally put it back in a tier of its own. Just my thoughts, guys. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.